And welcome back to the Hot Lap. We're talking the FIA getting stricter. Zero notice now on F1 factory inspections. Also, Christian Horner throwing shade at that Mercedes development. Pretty much saying the no pod, zero pod design was not particularly good. I guess he's got a point, but let's see what else he has to say. Also, last but not least, Marko on his Red Bull future. This is the Hot Lap, and well, is the FIA getting stricter? Let's get into it. And this is from motorsport.com by Jonathan Noble. He's saying the FIA said it wants to move forwards to a zero notice policy for factory inspections to ensure that Formula One teams are complying with the rules. The first thing that I'd like to say about that is, okay, do they give them notice anyway, saying we're going to be next week? That factory better be good. Not particularly very good, is it? When you have things now like budget caps, etc., and all the controversy around the 2022, well, in 2022 about the 2021 budget cap. Not particularly, I think, a good look from the FIA. But there we go. That's kind of what you expect from them at the moment, unfortunately. But let's hope they get it together. Anyway, the article says, as F1 regulations have gotten more complicated, there are now a number of restrictions that teams face in terms of the way they can operate at their own bases, a la the budget cap. We've got limits also on wind tunnel and CFD testing and how much information can be shared between collaborating squads. And if you remember, that's been slightly controversial because teams are a tiny bit worried about how good that AlphaTauri will be, because Red Bull and AlphaTauri have been very open about investing and working together a lot more for next year. Now, in a bid to ensure that teams are following these regulations, the FIA has long had the right to visit factories to check on things. Okay, absolutely. Previously, this has taken place with plenty of notice, which I think is absolutely crazy. But this is, of course, not ideal, it says, for the regulator in terms of catching anyone out trying to get around these regulations. However, the FIA's head of single seat, Nicholas Tumbazis, I got that wrong, sorry Nick, but he said that the governing body wants to get into a situation where they can immediately visit a factory. And he said, we want to go basically zero notice, he explained. We don't think we should just be entering the door and going in, but we do think it would be right to have a process in place where we can just phone them and somebody comes out and picks up these people and they can say, I want to go and see the wind tunnel or whatever. Tobias reckoned that it should not only be a case of the FIA being forced to wait long outside a factory for any inspection. He's thinking about 10 to 15 minutes, which I think is fair. He says, we want to get to the point where it's really quite immediate. He said, when asked about talking what would be ideal, we don't have to wait at the gate for an hour or something like that. And I completely agree. You turn up, you let in straight away. Otherwise, think about it. It's kind of like, if you ever remember when your parents told to clean your room, they come up to check you haven't been cleaning your room. And you're like, no, wait there, as you're rushing around throwing everything under the bed. So the FIA has recently expanded the number of personnel it has been available to help out with such factory work and reckons it's now in a place where these checks could be made every couple of weeks. They've said, we are aiming to expand for quite a long time now, but we were a bit understaffed, and that became apparent when the 2021 rules for the budget cap took quite a while to come out, and so did the 2022 ones, even though they had more staff. He said, we recently went to the target number of this team, and now that enables us to visit teams approximately every 2 to 3 weeks, which I personally think is absolutely fantastic. Goodness knows why they couldn't do it before in terms they're saying in terms of staffing, but I'm glad. I think everyone's now glad that's in place. Transparency is absolutely brilliant. That's something that I think Mohammed bin Salim promised when he came into the FIA, but it is something that in the lead up to Christmas with that whole Toto Wolff, Susie Wolff thing, not particularly very good, is it? But I guess there we go. But next up, we are talking about Horner on Mercedes. This is planetf1.com. So Red Bull, Horner has basically said he's been surprised that Mercedes stuck to their F1 car concept that he's described as clearly failed. This is from motorsport.com by Alex, and it says Christian Horner has said Red Bull was very surprised Mercedes struck with a Formula One concept that clearly failed in 2022, and also this year's in the unveiling at the very least in the first part of the season, the W14. After the two squads that fought, as we know, for the 21 titles, they ended up racing on different parts of the F1 pecking order at the start of this new ground effect era, with Red Bull hitting the ground running along with Ferrari and Mercedes kind of like at a canter behind them, snapping sort of at their heels, but embarrassingly so. Now, both teams eventually adopted, this is both Ferrari and Mercedes, Red Bull's downwash concept at the end of the 2023 campaign. But Horner told Motorsport.com in an exclusive interview at the Abu Dhabi season finale that his team had been surprised to see Mercedes and Ferrari had not taken the approach during the winter. When asked if his team had been feeling positive when Mercedes boss Toto Wolff announced that his squad would be abandoning this W13, W14, no pod, zero pod concept, Horner replied, well, Toto tends to be a little dramatic. Anyway, there we go, Horner. Throwing shade. I think what surprised us was that Ferrari had a very good car last year and the natural evolution of what we expected it to be a very tight contender this year. We were surprised to see Mercedes sticking with the concept that had clearly failed the previous year. If you looked around the cars in pre-season, the cars that were closest in concept to us were the Aston Martin and the McLaren. Horner is also insisted that the Red Bull began to feel it had the best chance to win both titles for the second year in succession when Max Verstappen won in Melbourne. He said the Australian event was one where Red Bull was defeated, if you remember in 2022, by Charles Leclerc. Verstappen ended up having a failure, but he just didn't have the pace of Leclerc. And Horner said that it was this year's Australian Grand Prix that it provided his team with the confirmation it had been seeking about its overall chances for the year ahead. Now, he said certainly coming out of Bahrain, we felt like we've got a good package here, but we didn't know whether it was a circuit specific. For example, when you're looking at the temperatures, the conditions and the asphalt. And he went on to say, so it's only when you've had a sample of 2 or 3 and you've gone to a couple of circuits that have been more troublesome, and I think he's talking about the troublesome circuits that Red Bull had in the past in their 22 campaign. And he said certainly for us in the previous year, like Melbourne for example, then suddenly you're thinking, okay, now this is really together. And yeah, so it takes a sample of a few races to get a clear overview. Nobody was coming out of Bahrain getting carried away, but even in pre-season testing, to be fair, it did look like Red Bull had stolen March on all the other drivers, and it kind of proved the case in Bahrain as well. And also, if you remember, Bahrain is one that we had a Ferrari 1-2 because of the Red Bull failures, but nevertheless Leclerc pretty much had that sealed up anyway before Verstappen went out. But Horner throwing shade again, I guess it makes good headlines, doesn't it, for this? And it was as far back as Abu Dhabi, so it's not particularly, I guess it's not particularly recent, but he's got a point. Mercedes had this concept. It didn't work in 2022. They did win that race in Brazil in 2022, or 1-2 in fact, with George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. But then the races after, they looked kind of average-ish again and didn't look like they were going to win. But they decided to keep that concept. And many people have been saying, had Mercedes, for example, not won in Brazil, would they then have been changing that concept if they didn't win? It's an interesting point. And Lewis Hamilton was being very vocal in the first half of the year about the Mercedes team not listening to him. No, Lewis Hamilton is no designer, but what he can do is tell you how a car feels and what he wants to get from it. And he's been really vocal about the rear of this year's Mercedes not being particularly good, not giving him confidence. And that really has been showing in his qualifying. But there we go. I digress. Last but not least, we've got Helmut Marko is set for imminent Red Bull talks. Yeah, he's revealed, this is from planetf1.com, talks will shortly commence about his future with Red Bull, but nothing's certain. Now, rumours about his future with the Red Bull team have swirled for some time. Now, Marko is 80 years old, and he's finding himself with this maelstrom in 2023, the website describes, but it has been, of negative comments, particularly about Perez, but he can't, kind of like Horner, he's like an extreme version of Horner. He can't help himself to give a good quote, which is great for the headlines and great for us. Now, so he made comments, as we know, about Sergio Perez after casting aspersions on his talents based on his nationality. Now, coinciding with that were unfounded rumours of a power struggle between him and Christian Horner. But that had all been downplayed. But Marko has made it clear that he's not enjoying his F1 duties as much since the death of the Red Bull owner and close friend Dietrich Mateschitz. Yeah. Anyway, his decisions are still open, he's basically said, on what happens next. As we know, they're still finding their way forward after the death of their founder. And the F1 team is enjoying the biggest success. They've just had the most record-breaking year that team has ever had. But the question is, what involvement is Marko going to have going forward? Now, opening up in an interview on Austria's OE24, I'm assuming that's a channel or something. Now, Marko explained that he's enjoying some quiet time back in his day job as a hotelier, but it confirmed that there will be talks next week about whether he will continue to work as strenuously through Red Bull's, as one of Red Bull's motorsport consultants. One tenuous possibility was for Marko was that Horner's role in F1 could be broadened to oversee both Red Bull and AlphaTauri, which Marko didn't really deny. He said, there are different trends and variants, he said. The decisions are still open, including what I will do next. My current contract runs until the end of 2024, so I'd like to think it should be sometime quite early next year, into the season, that we may well know. If you remember, Franz Tost quite early on in the season we were all informed that he would not be continuing, he'd pretty much be retiring. So it's going to be quite interesting to see what happens to Marko. Can he keep his mouth shut and not say anything controversial for 2024? I don't think so, but I kind of hope so for his sake, but I would not bet your mortgage on it, and I'm sure something will be coming from his mouth that's going to be printable in one of the big major Formula One news websites, etc. But anyway, there we go. If you enjoyed today, please leave us a like, leave us a subscribe. If you made it to the end, let us know. If you've just done one of them, that is more than enough. You're a champion in our eyes. If you've done both of them, 2 or more, you are a multiple world champion. This has been the Hot Lap. Thank you very much. Speak to you soon.